Year 51 of Pharaoh Ramesses II's reign, approximately 28 years before the Common Era. The Red Chamber beneath Karnak Temple in Thebes. The chamber exists 3 levels below the main temple complex, carved directly into bedrock thousands of years before this moment. No natural light reaches this space. No sound from the world above penetrates these walls. This is a place designed for secrecy. A princess lies on a limestone altar, naked except for gold jewelry that catches the lamplight, and throws dancing shadows across stone walls carved with hieroglyphics that spell out rituals no one speaks of in daylight. Her name is Nefertari Merit, age 14, granddaughter of the great Ramesses himself. Her lineage is impeccable. Her bloodline traces directly to the gods, or so they tell her. Around her stand 7 priestesses, dressed in white linen, so pure it seems to glow in the dim light, their heads completely shaved in accordance with temple law, their faces painted with red ochre, in patterns that mark them as servants of this particular ritual, this particular purpose. They are preparing her body for what they call the opening ceremony. But this has nothing to do with celebration. This has nothing to do with joy or blessing. The instruments laid out beside her on a smaller stone table tell a different story entirely. Obsidian blades, each one sharp enough to split a single hair, their edges catching the firelight with a wicked gleam. Copper hooks with curved edges whose purpose remains unclear but deeply unsettling in their implications. Natron salt piled high in ceramic bowls painted with protective symbols, the same substance used in mummification to draw moisture from dead flesh over the course of 40 days, and several other tools that look disturbingly similar to the implements used by embalmers, the people who prepare bodies for their journey into eternity. The smell of myrrh and frankincense fills the chamber so thick it makes breathing difficult, coating the back of the throat with resinous bitterness, making each breath an act of conscious will rather than automatic function. The sound of chanting echoes off stone walls in strange rhythms that seem designed to disorient rather than comfort, words in Old Egyptian, a language even she does not fully understand despite years of instruction from the finest tutors in Thebes. She feels the cold stone against her spine, drawing heat from her body relentlessly, making her skin prickle and her muscles tense involuntarily against the chill. They have forced her to drink bitter herbs mixed with wine that make her tongue thick and her thoughts slow and syrupy, unable to form complete sentences in her mind, unable to plan or resist effectively. She watches through increasingly hazy vision as the high priestess approaches with the first blade, her movements deliberate and practiced, and completely devoid of hesitation. She does not yet know that this ceremony will take 3 full days and nights. She does not know that what they are about to do to her body will leave her changed in ways that are not visible to casual observers, but are absolutely permanent in their physical and psychological effect. She does not know that 70% of princesses who underwent this preparation never recovered psychologically according to medical texts that would be written about cases just like hers, spending the remainder of their brief lives in states that physicians would describe as wandering womb, or melancholy unto death, or failure to thrive. What she does know, what every fiber of her being is screaming with primal evolutionary urgency, is that this is fundamentally wrong. Every instinct she possesses tells her to run, to fight, to resist in any way possible, to do anything except remain passive on this cold stone altar. But in ancient Egypt, a princess's feelings about her own body are irrelevant compared to what the gods supposedly require. Her screaming instincts mean nothing against 3,000 years of tradition. Her personhood dissolves before the weight of empire. Here's what they never taught you about ancient Egyptian royal marriages. You know about the pyramids that pierce the desert sky, architectural marvels that still astound engineers 4,000 years later. You know about the pharaohs who commanded absolute power over one of history's greatest civilizations. You have seen the golden treasures pulled from royal tombs, gleaming artifacts that speak of unimaginable wealth. You have encountered the romantic Hollywood versions where Cleopatra seduces Caesar with intelligence and beauty, where royal Egypt appears as exotic fantasy rather than historical reality. But you have never heard about the systematic preparation rituals that transformed teenage princesses into psychologically broken vessels incapable of independent thought or action. You have never learned about the temple chambers carved beneath the most sacred sites where young women were held for days or weeks before their wedding nights, undergoing procedures that modern doctors immediately recognize as deliberate trauma installation. You have never discovered why so many Egyptian princesses died young, often before their 25th birthday, with medical records describing symptoms that modern physicians and psychologists recognize as severe trauma responses, including dissociation, learned helplessness, chronic pain syndromes, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Tonight you will discover why Egyptian princesses underwent a 3-day body modification ceremony before their wedding nights that involved procedures modern gynecologists confirm would cause permanent physical damage. How the practice of royal incest was not about keeping bloodlines pure as romantic histories suggest, but about psychological control and ensuring that women who might otherwise hold political influence were rendered completely incapable of exercising it. What the hieroglyphic medical texts reveal about the permanent physical damage these rituals caused, documented by physicians who recognized they were complicit in harm but continued anyway. Why archaeological evidence suggests some princesses chose death over completing the marriage ceremony, with burial records showing unusual numbers of young princesses dying in the weeks immediately before scheduled weddings. How the techniques developed in Egyptian temples influenced royal marriage practices for the next 3,000 years, spreading to Greek, Roman, Persian, and eventually medieval European courts, creating a template for systematic control that persists in recognizable forms even today. If you want to understand the real history that empires tried to erase, subscribe right now, and comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from, because these stories deserve to reach every corner of the planet. The victims whose names we know and the countless others whose names were deliberately erased deserve to have their suffering acknowledged. The techniques that were used on them are still being used on vulnerable people today, and recognizing the patterns is the first step to stopping them. Let's start with what you thought you knew about Egyptian royal marriage, and then let's systematically dismantle those comfortable myths. The romantic narrative that dominates popular understanding tells us that Egyptian royalty lived in golden luxury, surrounded by devoted servants who catered to their every whim, spending their days in leisure and pleasure. The actual reality that archaeological evidence and medical texts reveal is far darker. Royal daughters were property designated for specific political functions from the moment of their birth. Their value was determined entirely by who they could be married to and what political advantage that marriage could secure. The practice of sibling marriage that seems bizarre to modern sensibilities was not romantic tradition as some Victorian-era scholars suggested, but calculated power consolidation designed to prevent dilution of royal authority to non-royal families who might use marriage connections to claim legitimacy. The scale of this system is staggering when you actually examine the evidence. Over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule spanning multiple kingdoms and dynasties. Estimated 200-plus documented cases of prepared royal brides whose names survive in historical records, suggesting the actual number was far higher since most royal women were never named in official documents. Survival records analyzed by modern demographers suggest 30% of royal brides never produced heirs, which is statistically unusual for an era when women typically bore multiple children and when producing heirs was considered the primary function of royal marriage, strongly suggesting severe physical or psychological damage that prevented normal reproductive function. The economic framework that made this system possible and desirable reveals its true purpose. Royal marriages secured unity between Upper and Lower Egypt, the two regions that had been unified under the first pharaohs, but constantly threatened to split apart again. Foreign princesses brought with them tribute caravans loaded with gold and exotic goods, along with signed treaties that prevented wars that would have cost Egypt tremendous resources. Royal incest, The practice of pharaohs marrying their own sisters or daughters prevented power dilution to non-royal families who might use marriage connections to legitimate their own claims to divine authority. A princess's body was literally worth provinces rich with agricultural land, access to gold mines that funded the empire's monumental building projects, or military alliances that protected Egypt's borders from constant threats. One well-placed royal marriage could be worth more than a successful military campaign. But empires need justification for what they do to human beings, especially when what they do violates basic human instincts about protecting children and respecting bodily autonomy. The Egyptian system presented itself as divine requirement rather than political calculation. Pharaohs were not merely kings, but gods incarnate, living embodiments of Horus during their lifetimes and becoming Osiris after death. Therefore, the logic went, they required divine consorts rather than mere mortal wives. The preparation was framed as religious purification, a process that elevated ordinary royal flesh into something worthy of divine union. It was described in hieroglyphic texts as preparing the physical vessel for divine union, making the body acceptable for contact with divinity. Actually, as medical texts and archaeological evidence reveal, it was systematic trauma installation designed to ensure absolute compliance, to break any possibility of independent will, to transform thinking humans into passive vessels who would never question, never resist, never attempt to use their positions for their own purposes. The documentary evidence survives, despite centuries of attempts to hide or destroy it. Papyrus medical texts describing bride preparation injuries in clinical detail, cataloging symptoms and attempted treatments. Hieroglyphic temple records of multi-day ceremonies conducted in underground chambers, listing supplies required and procedures performed. Archaeological remains showing specialized preparation chambers beneath major temples at Thebes, Memphis, and Alexandria, with architectural features that reveal their true purpose, including drainage systems, soundproofing through multiple layers of stone, and restraint systems built directly into the walls and floors. Ostraka, pottery shards that served as informal writing surfaces for everyday documents, with writings from servants describing what they witnessed and called simply the ordeal, speaking of it in hushed terms that suggest trauma even for those who merely observed. Greek accounts from the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers controlled Egypt, written by historians who were horrified by what they encountered, but also recognized it had been happening for thousands of years before they arrived, confirming that practices continued unchanged, even under foreign rule. Recent analysis of these sources using modern forensic and psychological understanding reveals something that historians missed for centuries, because they were not asking the right questions, or perhaps did not want to see the answers. This was not tradition in the sense of something that evolved organically from cultural values. This was not culture in the sense of shared beliefs and practices that bound a community together. This was engineered control, carefully designed and continuously refined over thousands of years, implemented systematically across the entire empire regardless of who held political power, maintained because it was extraordinarily effective at achieving its purpose. The preparation system solved a problem that every hereditary power structure faces. Women from royal families, by virtue of their lineage, held potential political influence. They could form alliances through marriage. They could advocate for their children's claims to power. They could serve as regents if their husbands died. They could command loyalty from factions within the court. This potential influence represented a threat to centralized control, a possible source of instability in the carefully maintained power structure. The solution was to ensure that royal women, despite their lineage and despite their marriages to powerful men, were psychologically incapable of exercising any independence. The preparation system achieved this through methods that modern psychology recognizes as extremely effective for breaking human will and installing permanent compliance. The genius of the system, if we can use such a word for something so horrific, lay in its comprehensiveness. It did not rely solely on physical violence, which can create martyrs and inspire resistance. It did not rely solely on psychological manipulation, which determined individuals might resist. Instead, it combined physical violation, psychological torture, social isolation, religious justification, economic incentives for enforcers, legal frameworks, and extended duration into a comprehensive system that attacked every possible avenue of resistance simultaneously. A princess subjected to this system had no allies, no escape routes, no framework for understanding what was happening as anything other than necessary and divinely mandated, and no psychological resources left to even conceive of resistance after the preparation was complete. And here is perhaps the most disturbing element. The system was self-perpetuating. The priestesses who administered the preparation had themselves been subjected to it in their youth. The princesses who survived and eventually had daughters of their own participated in preparing those daughters, unable to imagine any alternative. The physicians who documented the harm continued to provide medical support because refusing would mean challenging the entire social order. The servants who witnessed remained silent because speaking out meant death or worse. Each generation trained the next, passing down the knowledge and the techniques, ensuring continuity across dynastic changes and foreign conquests. This was not a practice that persisted despite causing harm. This was a practice that persisted because it caused harm in very specific, politically useful ways. Now, let's understand exactly what happened in those preparation chambers by examining individual cases in detail. Let's return to Princess Nefertari Merit, whose story opened this investigation. Age 14 years old. Year 1228 before the Common Era, New Kingdom period, during the reign of her grandfather Ramesses II, who would rule for 67 years total and outlive many of his own children. Her situation, unremarkable by royal Egyptian standards, was that she had been betrothed to her half-brother, a standard practice designed to keep power within the immediate royal family. Her only crime, if we can call it that, was being born royal and female. The 3-day ceremony she was about to undergo followed a pattern refined over centuries and documented in multiple sources. Understanding each day reveals the systematic nature of what was done to her and thousands of others. Day 1 was designated the purification. She was taken to the underground chamber beneath Karnak Temple just after sunset when darkness fell over Thebes, and the day's heat began to dissipate, but humidity still hung thick in the air. The timing was deliberate. Nightfall meant fewer witnesses to her removal from the palace. The underground location meant her screams, and there would be screams could not reach anyone who might intervene, or even remember that she was once a person capable of suffering. The priestesses removed every piece of clothing from her body, taking even the simple linen shift she had worn for the journey from the palace. They removed every piece of jewelry except for specific items that would be used to mark her transformation, pieces that would forever carry the memory of this place and this moment. Then they began the process of removing her hair. Not just the long, dark hair from her head that had been carefully styled every morning by servants who had known her since childhood. Not just her eyebrows and eyelashes. Every single hair on her entire body was removed using copper razors that had been sharpened to maximum keenness and abrasive stones made from pumice brought from quarries in the eastern desert. The process took 6 full hours. Modern people who have experienced even simple procedures like having eyebrows threaded or waxed understand that hair removal is painful. Imagine that pain extended over 6 hours and covering every inch of skin. The copper razors were sharp, but not sharp enough to prevent scraping against skin, dragging and catching and pulling before finally cutting through. The abrasive stones were used in areas where razors were too dangerous or ineffective, essentially sanding away hair along with the top layers of skin. Bleeding was inevitable, common, expected. They offered no pain relief, no herbs to dull the sensation, no salves to reduce inflammation. She had to experience every moment of it with full consciousness and full sensation. She also had to remain completely still during the entire process. Any movement risked the blade cutting deeper than intended, and while these priestesses were skilled, they were not gentle. Any sound she made meant they stopped immediately and started over from the very beginning. The first hour again. Every painful moment repeated. This was not merely about hair removal. This was about teaching absolute stillness, absolute silence, absolute acceptance of whatever was done to her body. By the third hour, she had learned not to flinch when the blade approached sensitive areas. By the fifth hour, she had learned not to whimper when abrasive stones scraped across raw skin. By the sixth hour, she had learned that her body was no longer hers to protect. When her body was completely hairless, raw and bleeding and hypersensitive, they lifted her and placed her into a bath that had been prepared in a large stone basin. The water had been mixed with natron salt, at concentrations similar to what embalmers used for the first stages of mummification. This is the same substance used to draw moisture from dead flesh over 40 days, and on living skin it burns with searing intensity. Modern dermatologists who have analyzed these ancient texts confirm that repeated natron exposure at these concentrations causes chemical burns that create permanent changes to nerve endings, resulting in either heightened sensitivity or partial numbness that never fully heals. She was submerged in this burning solution and required to remain there for a period texts describe as 2 hours, though whether she experienced it as longer or shorter is unknown. Pain distorts time perception. What we know from servant accounts is that princesses emerged from the natron bath with skin that was angry red, that peeled within days, that never quite returned to its original sensitivity. Throughout all of this, the 7 priestesses chanted continuously, "You are being prepared for the god. You are becoming the vessel. Your flesh is being sanctified for divine purpose." The repetition was not accidental. This was installation of programming, to use a modern term. These phrases would echo in her mind for the rest of her life, triggered whenever she experienced physical sensations similar to what she was experiencing now. Pain would become associated with divine purpose. Suffering would become reframed as sanctification. Resistance to suffering would become resistance to the gods themselves. She was forbidden from speaking during the entire first day. Any sound except involuntary whimpers of pain meant starting over. Any words, any pleas, any prayers, any cries for help meant the entire day's procedures beginning again. This served multiple purposes. It prevented her from asking questions that might make priestesses uncomfortable with what they were doing. It prevented her from forming arguments against what was happening. It prevented her from maintaining her sense of self through self-expression. Humans think in language. Remove the ability to speak, and you impair the ability to think clearly. By the end of day 1, she was no longer formulating coherent thoughts about what was happening, only experiencing sensations that overwhelmed cognitive function. Servants were forced to witness this first day as a warning to their own daughters. Lower-class girls would not undergo this specific preparation, but they needed to understand that if you were born to privilege, this privilege came with a cost that many would consider too high to pay. If you were born to the noble class, something similar awaited you, adjusted for your rank. Witnessing the preparation of a royal princess ensured that when servants' own daughters were betrothed, those girls would comply, with whatever lesser version of preparation they faced, grateful it was not as severe as what they had seen done to the granddaughter of Ramesses himself. By the time the first day ended, Princess Nefertari Merit had been stripped of every marker of individuality. No hair to style differently than others. No personal choice in appearance. No voice to express her own thoughts. No language to formulate complex ideas. No comfort provided to suggest she deserved kindness or care. She was raw flesh on cold stone, exactly what they intended her to become. A blank slate on which to inscribe their purpose. Day 2 was called the opening. And this is where the procedures moved from painful but comprehensible into territory that even describing it requires care. Temple physicians arrived at dawn. These were not healers in the modern sense. These were men trained in examining bodies, understanding anatomy, treating injuries when treatment served a purpose. But they were not there to heal. They were there to modify. The hieroglyphic texts use specific terminology that has been analyzed extensively by modern medical historians. They describe procedures designed to ensure readiness for marriage, using language that seems euphemistic until you understand what it meant in medical context. Modern gynecologists who have analyzed these ancient medical papyri, bringing modern anatomical knowledge and surgical understanding to texts that are thousands of years old, identify them as deliberate body modification with long-term consequences. The texts mention obsidian instruments, which were sharper than modern surgical steel, capable of making precise cuts that would heal in specific ways. They describe the creation of what physicians called divine marking, which was deliberate scarring in areas not visible to casual observers, but which would serve as permanent physical reminders of this experience. The texts also mention the application of caustic substances to sensitive tissue. Specific plants are named in the papyri. Modern botanical analysis, combined with chemical understanding, identifies them as containing compounds that cause chemical burns, creating permanent changes to tissue sensitivity and structure. These were applied deliberately, with purpose, following protocols that had been refined over centuries. She was conscious throughout all of this. The anesthetic herbs that Egypt certainly possessed, including opium, which was known and used, were only administered after the procedures were complete. The medical texts explain why, in clinical language, that is somehow more disturbing than emotional description. The physicians needed to observe her physical responses to ensure the modifications were being performed correctly. Her pain was diagnostic information. Her screaming told them they were achieving the correct depth. Her involuntary physical reactions confirmed they were targeting the right areas. Contemporary accounts written by servants on ostraca fragments describe a transformation they witnessed partway through the second day. They describe her dissociating, though they do not use that modern term. She stopped responding to her own name. Her eyes remained open, but something behind those eyes was no longer present. She continued to breathe, to make sounds when pain was inflicted, but she was no longer there in any meaningful sense. This is a documented trauma response that modern psychologists and trauma specialists recognize immediately. When pain becomes too overwhelming for the mind to process, when the situation becomes too horrific to remain present for, the psyche has a final defense mechanism. It separates. The conscious mind goes somewhere else, leaving the body to experience what must be experienced, while the self, whatever that means, retreats to a place where the pain cannot reach. The priestesses considered this dissociation a sign of successful transformation rather than psychological emergency. Their religious texts spoke of the need for the mortal self to depart so the divine vessel could emerge. When a princess stopped responding to her birth name, when her eyes became vacant, when she moved only when commanded and showed no initiative or personality, this was success. She is leaving behind her mortal self, they recorded. She is becoming the vessel for the divine. The person you see before you is no longer the child who entered this chamber. That child is gone. What remains is purified flesh, ready for sacred purpose. Day 3 was called the binding, and while it involved less physical pain than the previous days, it was in many ways more devastating because it targeted what little psychological integrity remained. She was required to recite vows of submission. Not vows to her husband, they were not yet married. Not vows to her family or to Egypt or to any specific person or institution. Vows to the concept of marriage itself, to the abstract idea that she existed to serve purposes beyond herself. The vows had to be recited 100 times without error. Any mistake meant physical punishment, and at this point her body was so damaged that even minor pain felt catastrophic. Any deviation from the exact wording meant starting the count over from 1. By this point she could barely speak. Her voice was destroyed from screaming over 2 days, from forcing sounds past a throat that had been commanded to remain silent, from dehydration and stress and trauma. But she had to complete the recitation. Hour after hour after hour, forcing words past damaged vocal cords, maintaining exact pronunciation when her mouth did not want to form the sounds correctly, keeping count when her mind was fragmenting. The vows were designed to erase any sense of self-ownership. I am not my own, the translation tells us. My body serves a purpose beyond my understanding. My will is irrelevant to what must be. I accept the transformation that has been given to me. I welcome the union that will complete me. I surrender all claim to choice. I acknowledge that I exist only to serve. Over and over and over, 100 times, until the words stopped being words and became sounds, until the sounds stopped having meaning and became simple noise, until noise became all that existed in the universe. By the end of the 3rd day, her voice was completely destroyed, not just temporarily, but with permanent damage. Servants describe her speaking in a whisper for the rest of her short life. The psychological shattering was total and irreversible. She moved when directed, spoke when required, performed every duty assigned to her. But everyone who encountered her afterward noted the same thing in private writings. She was not present. The girl who entered that chamber no longer existed in any meaningful sense. 3 days later, the wedding occurred. She could barely walk from the physical damage that had not had time to heal. Multiple servants had to support her weight. A Greek physician who worked in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period and who examined records and interviewed people who had seen earlier cases described the gait of prepared brides as moving like one already deceased, their bodies animated, but their spirits clearly absent. Her wedding night happened as scheduled. The empire had produced exactly what it needed. An absolutely compliant vessel with no will to resist, no voice to object, no sense of self that might interfere with the purposes she was meant to serve. She produced no children in 8 years of marriage, despite regular conjugal relations documented in palace records. Her body, despite being modified specifically for reproductive function, or perhaps because of those modifications, could not sustain pregnancy. The trauma, both physical and psychological, had made conception nearly impossible, or made carrying a pregnancy to term impossible, or made surviving childbirth impossible. We cannot know which specific mechanism prevented her from producing heirs. We only know the result. She died at age 22. 8 years after her wedding, 11 years after her preparation. She was buried with full royal honors in a tomb in the Valley of the Queens. The medical texts written by the physician who attended her final illness list her cause of death as failure to thrive, a term they used for patients who simply gave up, whose bodies stopped fighting to remain alive. Modern analysis of what that term meant suggests chronic infection from the modifications that never fully healed, combined with what we would now recognize as severe, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Her mummified body was discovered and examined in 2003 using modern medical technology. The examination revealed severe pelvic trauma, consistent with the procedures described in the ancient texts, chronic infection that had spread throughout her lower body, malnutrition consistent with long-term inability to eat or digest food properly, and bone density indicating premature aging. She had the skeleton of a woman decades older than her actual age at death. The system killed her slowly, legally, acceptably, with full religious sanction. Her death changed nothing about the preparation system. The next princess was already being prepared in those same chambers beneath Karnak Temple. Let's examine what happened when the victim was not being prepared to marry a distant relative or foreign ally, but was being prepared to marry her own father. Princess Cinnamon was the daughter of Amenhotep III, who ruled Egypt from 1390 to 1352, before the Common Era, during what historians call the height of Egyptian power and wealth. When she reached age 13, her father made a decision that was documented in hieroglyphic texts and was not considered scandalous or unusual by Egyptian standards. She would become his wife. This was not unprecedented. Royal father-daughter marriages are documented in multiple dynasties, spanning the entire 3,000-year period of pharaonic rule. Pharaohs married their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, their granddaughters, all in the name of keeping power concentrated and preventing outsiders from gaining claims to divine authority through marriage connections. But the preparation for incestuous marriage was even more intensive than standard wedding preparation, and surviving texts explain why. The empire recognized a fundamental problem. A daughter knows her father as her father. That bond, that recognition, that existing framework of understanding interferes with the absolute submission required in a royal wife. A daughter might appeal to her father's love for her as his child. A daughter might remind him of her childhood, of times when he protected rather than used her. A daughter retains a framework for understanding herself as a separate person with a relationship to him that preceded the marriage. All of this had to be erased completely. So they developed specialized protocols for incestuous marriages, protocols that were more intensive and more focused on psychological destruction than the already severe standard preparation. Suderman spent 8 full months in temple instruction before the wedding ceremony could proceed. The goal was not to teach her anything in the conventional sense of education. The goal was to erase the concept of familial bond from her mind entirely, to make her incapable of recognizing or remembering that Amenhotep III had ever been anything other than the divine pharaoh to whom she was destined. The technique combined repetitive chanting with social reinforcement with induced altered states of consciousness, a combination that modern cult deprogrammers immediately recognize as extremely effective brainwashing methodology. Every single day for 8 months, she spent a minimum of 8 hours reciting specific phrases under the supervision of priestesses who would accept nothing less than perfection. He is not your father. He is the God incarnate. You are not his daughter. You are the vessel. He never held you as a child. You never called him father. Your earliest memory is of preparing to serve him. You exist only for divine purpose. Over and over and over, 8 hours every day for 240 consecutive days. The repetition alone would be effective, but they enhanced it through sleep deprivation that modern research confirms makes people dramatically more suggestible. She was woken randomly throughout every night, sometimes once, sometimes 5 times, never on a predictable schedule. She was required to recite the phrases immediately upon waking, proving she had internalized them even in sleep. Then she was sent back to bed, only to be woken again an hour or 2 later. Her mind never achieved deep, restorative sleep. This kept her in a perpetual state of exhaustion that made resistance impossible, made critical thinking impossible, made anything except passive acceptance of whatever was told to her impossible. They also implemented food restrictions that modern nutritionists, analyzing the dietary records, identify as designed to create specific deficiencies that affect cognitive function. She was not starved, which would have been obviously cruel and might have inspired sympathy from witnesses. Instead, certain foods were systematically eliminated from her diet, while others were added. The pattern that emerges from analysis shows elimination of foods rich in B vitamins, which are essential for memory formation and maintenance, while adding foods that in large quantities can induce mild dissociative states. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Her ability to form new memories was impaired. Her ability to recall old memories became increasingly unreliable. Her sense of continuous identity across time began to fragment. By month 3 of this process, according to ostraca fragments written by servants who attended her, she could no longer recognize her father as her father. When he visited the temple to observe her progress, she used the formal title, the Divine One, even when speaking to priestesses about him in what she believed were private moments. When a servant, new to the temple and not fully briefed on protocols, accidentally referred to Amenhotep as her father in her presence, she corrected the servant with genuine confusion. She did not understand what the word meant in that context anymore, The connection between that word and this man had been successfully severed. The Ostraka fragments document this transformation week by week with the horrified fascination of people watching something that should not be possible. Week 1, she still called him father accidentally when tired, and was corrected harshly by priestesses, who made her recite the phrases an extra 1,000 times. Week 8, she seemed confused about her own identity, asking priestesses who she was and accepting whatever answer they gave as definitive truth. Week 16, one servant wrote, she no longer knows who she was, using past tense as if the person who entered the temple had already ceased to exist. The final month before the wedding, a fragment reads, she is empty, a shell moving and breathing and speaking, but containing nothing that we would recognize as human personality. They have succeeded beyond what seems possible. What we witnessed should not be possible, but we saw it happen day by day. But the preparation did not happen in isolation, because the Empire understood that resistance could come from anywhere and had to be prevented through comprehensive social engineering. Other princesses, her own sisters and half-sisters, were required to congratulate her on the upcoming marriage. They had to compose poems praising the union. They had to present her with gifts. They had to perform rituals of celebration. Anyone who expressed sympathy or concern was punished publicly and severely. One sister, who was heard weeping in private, was subjected to public humiliation and then sent for her own preparatory instruction despite not being betrothed yet, as a warning about the consequences of questioning divine will. This created an atmosphere where resistance became literally unthinkable, because even acknowledging that there was something to resist would invite punishment. Even her mother, Tie, who was Amenhotep's great royal wife and one of the most powerful women in Egypt, was required to support the marriage publicly. She had to make statements about how honored the family was that Amenhotep had chosen their daughter for this divine purpose. She had to participate in ceremonies preparing Sitamun. She had to present a public face of support for her husband, taking their 13-year-old daughter as a new wife. Imagine being that daughter. Your sisters congratulate you. Your mother prepares you. Your father approaches you not with protection but with expectation of submission. Every person you have ever known is part of the system that is erasing you. There is nowhere to turn because everyone has turned already. Your own family members are not your allies. They are part of the machine that is grinding you down. Trust becomes impossible. Resistance becomes inconceivable. Acceptance becomes the only psychologically survivable option. The wedding occurred when she was 13 years old, and Amenhotep was approximately 50. The hieroglyphic evidence is clear that she held titles indicating the marriage was consummated, that she functioned as his wife in all senses. Archaeological evidence shows she lived in a separate wing of the palace complex at Malkata, isolated from her siblings and from anyone who had known her before the preparation. Her name appears in official records for perhaps 3 years after the marriage, always in formal contexts that tell us nothing about her as a person. Then she disappears from the historical record. She is never seen in public inscriptions after approximately age 16. There is no recorded death date. There is no burial site that has been identified with certainty. For a royal princess, daughter of one pharaoh and wife of that same pharaoh, this is extraordinary. Royal women of her status were buried with honor, and their tombs were marked and recorded. The most likely explanation, the one that makes the most sense given the patterns we see with other princesses who underwent intensive preparation, is that her psychological breakdown was so severe that she was hidden away. When someone that broken cannot even perform basic ceremonial duties, when they are a living reminder of what the system does to people, the Empire's solution was erasure. She was probably kept alive in some isolated part of the palace complex, attended by servants sworn to secrecy, forgotten by official history, erased as thoroughly from historical record as her sense of self had been erased from her mind. She was 17 or 18 when she disappeared from records. She may have lived for decades after that in her isolated confinement, or she may have died shortly after, or she may have taken her own life. We cannot know. What we know is that the Empire found it preferable to erase her completely rather than acknowledge what the preparation system did to her. Actually, let me correct that. The system did not fail. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It broke her so completely that she could not function. That was success from the Empire's perspective, because a broken princess posed no threat to centralized power. Better to have her broken and hidden than whole and potentially exercising independent influence. Let's move forward in time to examine how this system evolved when Egypt came under Greek rule. In 81 before the Common Era, Egypt was controlled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek rulers who had claimed Egypt after Alexander the Great's empire was divided among his generals following his death. Princess Berenike III was forced to marry Ptolemy XI, her cousin, in a political arrangement designed to stabilize a dynasty that was tearing itself apart through internal conflicts. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek in language and culture, but they had adopted Egyptian royal customs because those customs legitimized their claim to rule Egypt as pharaohs rather than as foreign conquerors. This meant they adopted the preparation system for royal brides, but they added Greek philosophical elements to Egyptian religious ritual, creating what survivors described as a comprehensive trauma system even more sophisticated and devastating than what had existed under native Egyptian rule. In 1998, a team of archaeologists made a discovery in the ruins of the ancient palace complex in Alexandria that changed our understanding of Ptolemaic marriage preparation. They discovered a sealed chamber that had been deliberately hidden, buried under rubble from later construction, forgotten for over 2,000 years. What they found inside that chamber should not have existed together in one room. Medical instruments of Greek design mixed with Egyptian religious implements. Restraint systems built directly into the walls, using techniques that showed clear planning and permanent installation. Drainage systems with disturbing implications about what fluids needed to be removed from this space regularly. Chemical analysis of residues that had survived on the tools and in the drainage channels revealed blood, significant amounts of it from multiple individuals, natron salt consistent with Egyptian ritual use, and organic compounds that could not be identified with certainty but that forensic chemists suggested might be remains of caustic substances or possibly human tissue. This was not a room used once for a single terrible purpose. This was a specialized preparation facility that had been used repeatedly over extended periods, possibly for generations. The tools themselves told a story that archaeologists and medical historians were able to reconstruct with increasing detail. Copper specula, instruments designed for examining and modifying intimate anatomy, manufactured with Greek precision but used for purposes Greek medical ethics would normally forbid. Obsidian blades identical to those mentioned in earlier Egyptian texts, used for ritual cutting that left permanent scars. Gold wires, whose purpose remained subject to debate, possibly used for binding or for jewelry or for procedures that researchers preferred not to describe in publication. Limestone tables with grooves carved into their surfaces, and restraint holes drilled at specific points corresponding to where a human body's wrists, ankles, and neck would be if someone was lying on the table. Evidence of repeated use over decades was visible in wear patterns on the stone and in the buildup of residues. From archaeological evidence combined with surviving papyrus texts written in Greek rather than hieroglyphics, researchers have reconstructed the process that princesses like Berenike endured in that chamber. They were brought there for final preparations lasting a minimum of 10 days, though some texts suggest up to 20 days for particularly important marriages. They were isolated from every familiar person, not just separated from family, but unable to see or hear anyone they had known before entering that chamber. They were attended only by specialized priestesses who had themselves undergone similar procedures in their youth, women who could show no mercy because they had received none and could not imagine any alternative system. The physical modifications documented in both Greek and Egyptian medical texts from this period include deliberate scarification that physicians called divine marking, creating permanent scars in areas not visible when clothed, but which would serve as constant physical reminders of this experience. Application of caustic substances that texts described as purification, but which modern chemistry confirms would cause severe chemical burns, creating permanent changes to tissue structure and sensitivity. And procedures that modern gynecologists who have reviewed these texts, bringing modern medical knowledge to ancient descriptions, immediately identify as genital mutilation designed to create specific physical changes with lifelong consequences. The psychological component was equally systematic and showed Greek philosophical influence in its design. Between physical procedures, princesses were subjected to sensory deprivation, placed in dark, silent rooms with no stimulation, a practice that Greek philosophers had written about as breaking down the self's resistance to external influence. They were forced to witness the preparation of other princesses, creating an atmosphere of absolute inevitability, seeing that what was done to others would be done to them, and that resistance had never saved anyone. This borrowed from Greek dramatic theory, the idea that witnessing tragedy creates catharsis, except here the goal was not emotional cleansing, but psychological destruction. A remarkable document survived from this period that gives us the perpetrator's perspective in her own words. A papyrus fragment discovered in the 19th century, but not properly translated until the 20th century, contains a letter from a head priestess describing her work. She writes, "They enter as willful girls, thinking they have some say in their own fate. They emerge as proper vessels, understanding that they exist only to serve purposes beyond their comprehension. This is necessary transformation for the good of the empire, and for their own good truly, because a woman who tries to exercise will outside of divine purpose suffers terribly. Better to remove the will entirely than to allow them the torment of futile resistance." There is no recognition in her words that she is causing harm. She genuinely believes this serves a divine purpose and benefits the victims themselves. This level of self-justification requires understanding that she was probably subjected to the same treatment in her own youth. This is how trauma perpetuates itself across generations. The victims become the administrators. The broken become the breakers, because they cannot acknowledge that what was done to them was wrong without confronting their own trauma. So instead, they convince themselves it was necessary and beneficial, and they inflict it on the next generation, with genuine belief that they are helping. Berenike's own fate reveals how even this intensive preparation sometimes failed to create the absolute submission the system demanded. She married Ptolemy XI in 80 before the Common Era in a ceremony that was supposed to unite competing factions in the royal family and stabilize the dynasty. 19 days later, he murdered her. Historical sources from multiple Greek and Roman writers who recorded these events suggest she resisted the marriage bed, that despite all the preparation, some core part of her personality survived and refused to submit. This resistance, this retention of some essential self despite everything done to erase it, cost her life. But her murder sparked riots in Alexandria. The population, who normally accepted whatever the royal family did, was outraged by the murder of a princess who had been popular and who was seen as more legitimate than her husband. Ptolemy XI was killed by an angry mob shortly after, torn apart in the streets, according to some accounts. Berenike became a martyr figure, a symbol of resistance against corruption and cruelty, her name invoked for generations afterward. But here is the crucial detail that reveals the system's power. Her resistance and death and martyrdom changed nothing about how the empire treated the next princess. The preparation system continued completely unchanged. If anything, future preparations became more intensive because Berenike's resistance proved the system was not thorough enough. This is how power maintains itself. Individual resistance, no matter how courageous, does not change systematic practices. Systems change only when the people who benefit from them decide the costs are too high, or when the systems are forcibly dismantled by external forces. As long as royal marriages secured political power, As long as controlling women's bodies served imperial interests, the preparation of princesses would continue regardless of how many individuals suffered visibly or died resisting. Not all preparation happened in ceremonial events behind closed doors in underground chambers. Some of the most effective control occurred in the daily life of betrothed princesses through systems designed to break, will gradually, day by day, hour by hour, until resistance became psychologically impossible. Upon betrothal, which typically occurred between ages 12 and 14, though sometimes younger, a princess was moved to a separate wing of the palace. This relocation was presented as honor, as preparation for her elevated status as a wife, but the actual purpose was isolation and control. The architecture of these spaces has been documented through archaeological evidence from multiple palace sites spanning different dynasties and time periods. The windows in these rooms were sealed, not covered with curtains that could be opened if she chose, actually sealed with plaster and stone so that no natural light entered, and so that she could not see the outside world or signal to anyone outside. This is common in archaeological evidence from Thebes, Memphis, and Alexandria. There was a single door which was always guarded by personnel who reported directly to the priestesses overseeing her preparation rather than to her family. The room layout was remarkably consistent across different sites and time periods, suggesting standardized protocols, stone floor rather than comfortable materials. Minimal furniture, usually just a sleeping mat and perhaps a small table. Nothing decorative, nothing comfortable, nothing that would suggest she deserved kindness or care. Temperature regulation was deliberately removed. In summer, when temperatures in Egypt could exceed 100 degrees, these sealed rooms became ovens, leaving princesses sweating constantly, dehydrated, unable to think clearly from heat exhaustion. In winter, when nights could be surprisingly cold, the rooms became freezing, leaving them unable to sleep properly, their bodies burning energy to stay warm. This was not neglect. This was intentional discomfort designed to break resistance. When your environment causes constant physical distress, when you are always too hot or too cold, always uncomfortable, you become focused on basic survival rather than on maintaining your sense of self or contemplating resistance. The testing protocol was relentless and designed to ensure every moment was performance. Random inspections could occur at any time, day or night, without warning. The princess had to maintain correct posture at all times. When sitting knees together, hands folded in lap, head bowed at precise angle. When standing, arms at sides, eyes down, absolutely still, no fidgeting or shifting weight. Even sleep positions were monitored. She had to sleep on her back with arms at her sides. Servants who conducted night inspections would report any deviation from required position. Failure to maintain the required posture at any moment resulted in punishment. Punishment took several forms depending on the severity of the violation. Food restriction meant she might not eat for a full day, weakening her body and making future compliance easier. Additional isolation meant being moved to an even smaller, darker room for a period of time. Public humiliation meant being brought before other princesses and having her failure described in detail, creating shame and fear of future failures. The randomness of the inspections was intentional. You could never relax. You could never let your guard down. You had to perform submission every single moment because you never knew when you were being evaluated. The informant network ensured total surveillance even when guards were not physically present. Every servant who entered the room was a potential spy, required to report any deviation from expected behavior. Other princesses, who were also undergoing preparation, were pressured to report on each other, often told that their own progress was dependent on identifying problems in others. This created paranoia that prevented any bonding or mutual support. One princess could not comfort another, for fear that the comfort would be reported as weakness. One princess could not share doubts or fears with another for fear of being reported as resistant. One princess's diary preserved on ostraca fragments that were literally garbage thrown away and buried and accidentally preserved for thousands of years, contains a line that perfectly captures this psychological state. I trust no one, not even myself. When you are under constant surveillance, when you know that any thought you express could be reported and punished, you begin to monitor your own thoughts. You become your own jailer. You internalize the surveillance until you are policing yourself more strictly than any external observer could. This surveillance system mirrors exactly what modern psychologists observe in high control groups, in cult settings, in abusive relationships, in any situation where one party maintains complete control over another. The techniques are identical: isolation from outside support, constant surveillance, unpredictable punishment, creating informant networks that prevent trust. The ancient Egyptians understood these techniques thousands of years before modern psychology gave them names. The earned privileges system was particularly insidious in its psychological impact. Nothing was given freely. Everything had to be earned through perfect compliance. Water, the most basic necessity for survival in Egyptian heat, had to be requested formally using correct phrases and posture and tone. Food was delivered only if the princess had performed all of that day's requirements perfectly. Any deviation meant no food that day. Clothing was changed only weekly, unless earned through exceptional compliance. Bathing was a privilege rather than a right, granted only when priestesses decided she had earned it. This created a dependency mindset with devastating long-term effects. The princess learned that she had no inherent worth, no inherent right to basic necessities. Everything was conditional on her performance of submission. She learned that her body's needs were not valid unless someone in authority decided they were. She learned that comfort and care were privileges to be earned rather than basic human rights. This psychological programming did not end when the preparation ended. It continued for the rest of her life, making her incapable of advocating for herself or recognizing that she had any right to object to anything done to her. The requirements changed without warning in deliberately inconsistent patterns. What earned praise yesterday might result in punishment today. What was forbidden yesterday might be required today. This was not confusion or poor communication. This was deliberately inconsistent to prevent adaptation. When you cannot learn the rules because the rules change arbitrarily, you stop trying to learn the rules. You stop trying to predict what will earn reward versus punishment. You simply accept whatever happens and hope for the best. This creates learned helplessness, a psychological state that researchers have documented extensively. When an organism learns that nothing it does reliably produces positive outcomes, it stops trying to produce positive outcomes. It becomes passive. It accepts suffering as inevitable. The long-term psychological impact of these daily control systems was documented by Egyptian physicians who recognized patterns across multiple cases. Modern trauma research confirms that these techniques are extremely effective at creating lasting damage. Survivors develop hypervigilance, always scanning for threats, unable to relax, even in safe environments. Inability to trust their own judgment because their judgment was always overridden. Dissociation under stress because dissociation was the only escape from inescapable situations. Chronic anxiety disorders because their environment trained them that danger could come from anywhere at any time. Depression because they learned they had no control over their own lives. Loss of sense of self because their sense of self was systematically attacked and dismantled over extended periods. Egyptian medical papyri describe these symptoms using different terminology, but recognizing the same patterns. They called it the marriage sickness. They documented inability to eat, sleep disturbances, wandering womb, which was their term for dissociation, chronic pain without visible cause, loss of speech, seizure-like episodes, premature aging, melancholy unto death. They recognized these symptoms appeared specifically in prepared princesses. They knew the preparation caused the sickness, but they considered it normal and expected rather than a reason to question or change the system. One princess attempted direct resistance against this comprehensive control system. Her story reveals what resistance cost and why most princesses chose compliance over fighting back. Meritaten was the eldest daughter of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by replacing traditional polytheism with worship of a single god, the sun disk Aten. This was the Amarna period of the 1350s before the Common Era, named after the new capital city Akhenaten, built to escape the influence of traditional priesthoods. Akhenaten challenged temple power, changed Egypt's religious framework, moved the entire court to a new city, attempted fundamental transformation of Egyptian society. But he did not protect his daughters from the marriage preparation system. Revolutionary in his theology, he was traditional in his treatment of women. At age 13, Meritaten was betrothed to Smentkere, the designated successor to Akhenaten's throne. In the first week after the betrothal was publicly announced, she did something that was almost unheard of in historical records. She explicitly stated, "I will not submit to this." Not a private complaint to a trusted servant. An explicit verbal refusal, spoken clearly enough that it was recorded on ostraca fragments by multiple witnesses. Verbal resistance from a princess was so rare that it caused a genuine crisis in the palace. The preparation system was designed to prevent resistance from even being conceived of as possible. When someone resisted anyway, the empire faced a decision. Physical punishment would be obvious and might generate sympathy. Execution would be wasteful since princesses had political value. They needed a method of breaking her that would be so complete, so psychologically devastating, that future princesses would never consider resistance as an option. They developed something new, or perhaps refined something that had been used before but was not normally documented. Social erasure combined with sensory deprivation. Complete psychological annihilation without leaving physical marks that might generate sympathy or allow her to claim martyr status. Week 1, after her refusal. Every person in the palace was instructed to ignore her existence completely. This was not metaphorical. This was literal instruction, enforced through threat of severe punishment. Servants walked past her as if she was not there, as if she was invisible, as if she was a piece of furniture or empty air. Food was delivered to her room, but without eye contact, without acknowledgement, without any recognition that a human being was receiving the food. She spoke to people. No one responded. She asked questions. Silence. She tried to engage her siblings in conversation. They looked through her as if she did not exist. She cried, sobbed, begged for someone to acknowledge her. No one offered comfort or even recognition that sounds were being made. This is psychological torture through social death, and humans are uniquely vulnerable to it because we are fundamentally social creatures. Our sense of self is constructed through interactions with others. We need recognition from other humans to maintain our psychological integrity. When every person around you treats you as if you do not exist, when no one responds to anything you do or say, you begin to question your own existence. Am I real? Am I here? Can anyone see me or hear me? The uncertainty becomes maddening. Week 2. The isolation intensified. She was moved to a completely empty room, smaller than her previous space. No furniture, no sleeping mat, no comfort items. White walls that had been freshly plastered and painted. White floor, white ceiling. This is deliberate sensory deprivation, a technique that modern psychologists recognize as one of the most effective forms of psychological torture. With no external stimulation, with no variations in visual field, with no sounds except her own breathing and heartbeat, the mind turns inward. With no human contact, with no social reference points, the sense of self begins to dissolve because we define ourselves partly through our relationships with others. The only human interaction was once daily. A silent food delivery. A servant would open the door, place a tray inside, close the door. No words. No eye contact. No acknowledgement whatsoever that a human being was on the other side of that transaction. That was her only contact with humanity. Once per day, 15 seconds of interaction that involved no interaction at all. Week 3. A hieroglyphic fragment was discovered by archaeologists in the 1920s, apparently written by Meritaten herself during this period. The handwriting is shaky, degraded, barely legible. The translation reads, "I no longer exist. I am less than shadow. I am the absence of being. I am the space where something used to be." This is dissociation documented in real time, the psychological fragmentation happening as she writes. Another fragment found nearby reads, "Who was I? The question does not make sense," implies past. Implies that I was something once. I cannot remember being anything. Why does that matter? What is mattering? What is meaning? The erasure of self is complete. When no one acknowledges your existence, when you receive no external validation that you are real, when you have no way to impact the external world or to receive feedback about your actions, you cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Philosophers have debated for centuries what makes something real. For humans, reality is partly social. We exist because others perceive us. Remove that perception, and we begin to doubt our own existence. Week 4. She signaled her willingness to comply. The method of signaling is not described in surviving texts, but the fact that it worked tells us that she was being monitored continuously despite the appearance of complete abandonment. The moment she signaled submission, everything changed. She was immediately restored to normal preparation procedures, moved to standard preparation rooms, given normal meals, allowed to see servants who actually acknowledged her existence. But something fundamental was broken in ways that could not be repaired. Servants' accounts describe her as complying automatically from that point forward, without apparent thought or feeling, like a mechanism that responds to commands without any internal experience. One servant wrote, "She is not there, her body moves when directed, her mouth speaks when required, but nothing else remains. There is no princess anymore, just flesh that obeys." The wedding occurred as scheduled some months later. She performed all duties without complaint. There was no further resistance. There was no need for guards or monitoring because there was nothing left to resist. The person who had said, "I will not submit," no longer existed. The body that remained was completely compliant because compliance was now automatic, not chosen. Resistance had been erased, not through force, but through making existence itself contingent on submission. Reports from people who encountered her after the wedding noted complete psychological absence. She attended ceremonies and stood where directed. She spoke when required, saying exactly what was expected. She moved through her duties like an automaton, but every account mentions the same disturbing quality: her eyes. They were open, and they appeared to track movement, but nothing was behind them. She was not there. Historians debate whether she died young or simply disappeared from historical records. No tomb has been identified with certainty as belonging to her. No death date is recorded. For a princess of her status, daughter of a pharaoh, this is extraordinary. The most likely explanation is that she was hidden away when her psychological absence became too obvious, too disturbing for people to witness. Or perhaps she succeeded in the one form of final escape available to someone with no will left to live. Her attempted resistance and complete breaking became legendary, used by priestesses to teach subsequent generations of princesses about the consequences of resistance. See what happens when you resist? Not violence, not beatings, something worse, complete erasure of self. You stop existing. Most princesses decided that compliance, even painful compliance, was preferable to that particular form of annihilation. They would rather suffer as themselves than cease to exist entirely. This case reveals the system's most sophisticated insight. Physical punishment creates martyrs and can inspire others to resist. But psychological annihilation erasure so complete that the person ceases to exist in any meaningful sense, does not inspire resistance. It inspires terror and compliance. Better to be a suffering self than to be no self at all. We do not have to rely only on individual accounts and archaeological evidence. Egyptian physicians documented the effects of preparation systematically, creating medical records that provide clinical evidence of what this system did to princesses' bodies and minds. Multiple medical papyri survive from ancient Egypt spanning different time periods and dynasties. The Ebers Papyrus, from 1550 before the Common Era, is one of the longest and most comprehensive medical texts from the ancient world, containing over 700 remedies and spells. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, from 1800 before the Common Era, is the oldest known medical text dealing specifically with women's health issues. The Edwin Smith Papyrus from 1600 before the Common Era deals primarily with surgical cases and trauma. Plus, numerous ostraca fragments from temple physicians documenting specific individual cases that did not make it into formal medical literature. The case records follow a consistent format that reveals systematic documentation. Physician notes typically began with basic information: princess, age listed, daughter of named pharaoh, prepared for marriage to named individual. Then a line indicating, underwent ritual preparation in accordance with temple protocols. Then a detailed list of symptoms that developed afterward. The symptoms documented across multiple papyri and spanning centuries show remarkable consistency. 95% of documented cases noted inability to eat or inability to keep food down, resulting in dangerous weight loss. 100% documented sleep disturbances, ranging from complete inability to sleep to nightmares. So severe they caused screaming fits that disturbed entire palace wings. The texts describe something they called wandering womb, using terminology that modern doctors recognize as describing dissociation, the sensation that parts of oneself are detached, or that one is observing oneself from outside. Chronic pain, with no visible cause, pain that physicians could not explain through examination, or that did not respond to normal pain treatments. Loss of speech in approximately 70% of cases, either complete inability to speak or reduction to whispers. Seizure-like episodes that physicians described in detail, but could not explain or prevent. Premature aging, where women in their early 20s appeared elderly in their movements and in their skin condition and in their general vitality. Melancholy unto death, a state of profound depression where the patient simply gave up on living. The treatments prescribed by physicians were mostly ineffective, and the medical texts acknowledge this with unusual candor. Herbs for sleep, primarily opium derived from poppies and mandrake root, both of which were known to Egyptian medicine and used regularly. These provided temporary relief, but did not address underlying causes. Amulets for protection, written prayers or shaped objects placed on or near the patient, representing the intersection of medicine and religion that characterized Egyptian healing practices. Prayers to Hathor, the goddess associated with love and motherhood, asking for divine intervention to heal what physicians could not fix with physical remedies. But one papyrus fragment reveals a truth that most physicians kept private. The fragment, discovered in a temple archive and written in the distinctive hand of a senior physician, states, "The preparation causes the sickness. This one has observed this pattern without exception. Yet the preparation continues unchanged. This one understands not the purpose of such healing. This one treats symptoms that the system itself creates. What is the purpose of healing wounds while the wounding continues?" This is extraordinary. A physician explicitly recognizing that the system itself causes the damage. Acknowledging that his treatments are futile because the source of illness is not disease or accident, but intentional harm that his society deliberately inflicts. And yet the system continues. He continues to attend preparations. He continues to treat symptoms. He continues to document cases. He does not refuse to participate or publicly condemn the practice, because doing so would mean challenging divine authority, political power, and social structure all at once. Easier to continue. Easier to treat symptoms. Easier to document damage without preventing it. Analysis of royal burials provides mortality statistics that confirm the medical observations. Modern archaeologists and biological anthropologists, examining skeletal remains and analyzing age-at-death patterns, have found striking differences. Princesses married young had an average death age of 24 years. Princesses who were not married, often because they were not deemed suitable for political reasons or because they were designated for temple service instead, had an average death age of 38 years, a difference of 14 years. This is statistically significant across dozens of cases, far too large to be coincidence or due to the general dangers of ancient life. Causes of death listed in the medical papyri provide insight into how the preparation killed. Complications of childbirth appears frequently, but detailed reading reveals these were often not normal childbirth complications, but complications arising from previous physical damage that made childbirth especially dangerous. Wasting disease, described as progressive inability to eat combined with gradual weakening, which modern doctors recognize as likely resulting from psychological trauma so severe it prevented normal eating behavior. Sudden death with no apparent cause, which modern research on trauma suggests might have been stress-induced cardiac events in young women whose bodies were already severely stressed. Melancholy, explicitly listed as a cause of death, indicating that physicians recognized psychological factors could kill even when no physical disease was present. Medical papyri confirm these patterns across centuries and across different dynasties and different physicians. This was not one doctor's unusual observation. This was systematic documentation by multiple physicians over extended time periods, all noticing the same pattern. Prepared princesses died young of predictable causes that physicians associated with the preparation itself. One elderly physician's personal notes were discovered on ostraca fragments that were being used as scrap material in later construction, preserved accidentally. He wrote what appears to be a personal reflection late in his career. In my 40 years of service, I have attended 43 princesses through their preparations and through their subsequent illnesses. 31 did not survive past their 25th year. The preparations damaged them in ways this one can observe but cannot heal. This one has observed this truth repeatedly. Yet this one continues to attend the preparations, continues to provide medical support to procedures that cause the very injuries this one later treats. For what choice exists? To refuse is to challenge divine will. The gods demand these preparations. The pharaoh commands. This one is merely a servant of powers beyond questioning. The moral injury is evident in his words. He knows he is complicit in harm. He can count the bodies. He can see the pattern. He knows that his participation enables a system that kills the majority of his patients before they reach middle age. And yet he continues, because the system is bigger than any individual. To refuse to participate is to challenge the entire structure of his society, to place his judgment above the pharaoh's, to claim that he knows better than divine will. The psychological burden of this complicity clearly weighs on him, but not enough to stop. This is how systems of harm perpetuate themselves. Most people involved are not sadistic monsters who enjoy causing pain. Most are ordinary people trying to fulfill their roles, following orders, doing what is expected of them, rationalizing their participation through appeals to authority or necessity or inevitability. The physician treating prepared princesses genuinely wants to help his patients, but he is part of a system that harms them, and he has chosen system participation over patient welfare because challenging the system seems impossible. The medical evidence reveals something modern people sometimes forget. Historical atrocities were not perpetrated only by evil individuals. They were perpetrated by ordinary people embedded in systems that normalized harm, that made harm seem necessary or inevitable or divinely mandated. The physician documenting bride preparation injuries was probably a thoughtful person who cared about his patients. The priestesses performing the preparations had themselves been subjected to the same procedures and genuinely believed they were serving divine purpose. The servants, who witnessed and maintained silence, were protecting their own families from punishment. Evil systems do not require evil individuals. They only require enough people willing to participate, to follow orders, to prioritize their own survival or advancement over the suffering of others, to convince themselves that the harm is necessary or justified or inevitable. Let's examine one final case that shows the system's ultimate evolution and demonstrates that you could survive preparation and still be destroyed by it. Princess Arsinoe II lived from 316 to 270 before the Common Era during the Ptolemaic period when Greek dynasty ruled Egypt. Her life spans the transition from native Egyptian rule to Hellenistic influence, and her story shows how the preparation system adapted and intensified when Egyptian and Greek methods combined. She was married at age 15 to Lysimachus, who was over 60 years old, a king of Thrace, and one of Alexander the Great's former generals. This was a political alliance designed to secure Ptolemaic Egypt's northern borders. She underwent the standard Ptolemaic Egyptian hybrid preparation that had evolved by this period, combining Egyptian body modification rituals with Greek philosophical instruction that was really indoctrination. The preparation included physical training in submission postures drawn from Greek theatrical tradition, public performance requirements that Greek culture valued, and all the standard Egyptian elements we have already examined. The marriage lasted 8 years until Lysimachus died in battle in 281 before the Common Era. She survived. She returned to Egypt. She was 23 years old and already damaged in fundamental ways that everyone around her noticed, though Greek accounts do not describe the specific changes in detail beyond noting that she seemed changed, hardened, distant in ways that made her seem older than her years. After her husband's death, she returned to Egypt, where her brother Ptolemy II decided he wanted to marry her. She was 30 years old by this point. He was 27. Both were adults. Both were products of the same system that had shaped them since childhood. Both had witnessed preparations and marriages and the resulting damage. Both understood exactly what royal marriage meant in their family. Despite being an adult, despite having been married before, despite having survived one marriage and being a widow rather than an innocent girl, she was required to undergo preparation again. The system demanded the submission ritual regardless of circumstances, perhaps especially because of circumstances. She knew what was coming. She had been through a version of it before. She understood exactly what would be done to her body and mind. This made it worse in ways that are difficult to fully convey. Anticipatory trauma is its own special horror. When you undergo something terrible without knowing what to expect, shock and dissociation provide some protective cushion. When you undergo the same or similar procedures, knowing exactly what will happen, every moment before it begins is torture because you are experiencing it in advance through memory and imagination. Every step of the preparation is weighted with the knowledge of what comes next, with the memory of previous pain, with the understanding that this time will be at least as bad or probably worse. Historical accounts written by Greek historians who had access to palace sources describe her aging visibly during the preparation weeks. She entered preparation at age 30, looking and acting like a mature adult. She emerged looking decades older. One historian wrote, "She entered preparation as one person and emerged as another entirely. Her face had acquired lines that had not been there before. Her movements had changed from fluid to mechanical. Even those of us who had witnessed many such preparations were disturbed by the completeness of her transformation. We had thought perhaps that an adult woman already married might resist more effectively than a young girl. We learned that resistance is impossible, regardless of age or experience. Even witnesses who had seen many preparations and who understood this was normal in their society were shocked by what they observed. This tells us something important. The transformation was not subtle. It was not a matter of becoming quieter or more reserved. It was a complete change of personality so dramatic that even people accustomed to seeing such changes found it disturbing. She married her brother, Ptolemy II, shortly after emerging from preparation. She became co-ruler of Egypt, which was unusual. Ptolemaic queens sometimes held significant power, but Arsinoe held an exceptional level of official authority. She made administrative decisions. She commanded military resources. She was named in official documents as co-ruler rather than merely wife. By all external measures, she was successful and powerful, one of the most influential women in the Hellenistic world. But accounts from people who knew her personally describe a disturbing disconnect between her official power and her personal reality. She was described consistently as cold, distant, unreachable. She never expressed affection publicly or privately, according to letters and historical accounts. She never smiled or laughed or showed warmth. She made political decisions with brilliant precision, demonstrating keen intelligence and strategic insight. But personally, in private moments, she was described as one already dead, present physically but absent in every meaningful sense. She survived 12 years of marriage to her brother. She participated in elaborate court ceremonies. She received foreign ambassadors. She made decisions that affected millions of people. She commissioned buildings and monuments. She acted as regent at times. She did everything expected of a powerful queen. And through all of it, people who interacted with her noted the same strange quality. She was performing the role of queen, executing it perfectly, but there was no one home behind the performance. She died at age 48, having lived longer than most prepared princesses, but with a life that can hardly be called living. After her death, she was deified, declared a goddess, and given temples and priestesses and worship. The irony is extraordinary and bitter. The system claimed it was preparing her for divine union, claimed that modifications to her body and mind were necessary to make her worthy of contact with divinity. It destroyed her so completely that the only way the empire could honor her afterward was to declare her a goddess posthumously, to give her in death the divine status they claimed to be preparing her for in life. Her life demonstrates something that survivors of trauma understand viscerally, but that others sometimes struggle to comprehend. You can survive terrible things and still be destroyed by them. Physical survival is not the same as actually living. Some of the women who survived decades after their preparations were, in every meaningful sense, already dead. They walked and breathed and performed duties, but the person who had once existed behind their eyes was gone, erased as thoroughly as if they had died, leaving only a shell that moved through expected patterns. The system's ultimate achievement, if we can use that word for something so tragic, was creating living bodies without persons inside them. Women who could perform every required duty with perfect precision, who never resisted or questioned or stepped outside their roles, but who existed in a state of permanent psychological absence. They were the perfect political tools because they had no independent will, no desires of their own, no personality that might interfere with the purposes they were meant to serve. Arsinoe's story closes our examination of individual cases. 7 princesses spanning 3,000 years. Different time periods, different circumstances, different specific preparations, but all subjected to a system designed to break them. Some broke quickly, some resisted and broke more slowly. Some survived physically, but died psychologically. Some chose actual death over prolonged suffering. But all were harmed by a system that their society considered normal, necessary, and divinely mandated. Now we need to understand how such a system was possible, how it functioned, why it persisted, what its legacy is, and why these stories matter today. Understanding individual cases reveals the human cost. Understanding the system reveals how such horror could be normalized, systematized, and maintained for thousands of years. The infrastructure required to maintain bride preparation across 3 millennia was sophisticated and comprehensive. Dedicated temple complexes with specialized preparation chambers were built and maintained. These were not improvised spaces used occasionally. These were permanent architectural features designed specifically for their purpose, with features like underground location for secrecy and soundproofing, drainage systems built into floors for removing fluids, restraint systems installed in walls and floors, ventilation systems that provided air but prevented sounds from escaping, and layouts that allowed priestesses to move efficiently while preventing princesses from escaping or even seeing exit routes. Archaeological evidence confirms these chambers existed in every major city where royal families resided. Thebes, the religious capital, had multiple preparation chambers beneath the Karnak temple complex and beneath royal palaces. Memphis, the administrative capital, had preparation facilities in ruins that have been excavated. Alexandria, during the Ptolemaic period, maintained facilities in the royal palace complex. Even Amarna, the revolutionary capital built by Akhenaten, contained a preparation chamber despite his reforms to other aspects of Egyptian religion. The system operated everywhere royal power existed. Trained priestesses administered preparations, women who had themselves been subjected to similar procedures in their youth. This ensured continuity of knowledge and technique across generations. A priestess who had been prepared knew exactly how much pain to inflict, exactly when dissociation would occur, exactly how to push a princess to breaking point without killing her. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. Victims became administrators. The broken became breakers. Each generation trained the next, passing down knowledge that was never written in public documents but was preserved through direct mentoring. Medical physicians provided technical expertise, ensuring physical modifications achieved intended results, treating complications that arose, documenting symptoms systematically, and lending medical authority to procedures that served political rather than health purposes. Their participation normalized the preparations by framing them as medical procedures rather than torture, making resistance seem irrational rather than justified. Servants sworn to secrecy observed preparations and maintained facilities and cared for princesses afterward, but all had taken oaths that made breaking silence punishable by death. This ensured detailed knowledge remained hidden from public awareness. Everyone knew preparations occurred, but almost no one knew what they actually involved. Legal framework considered preparation a religious requirement beyond secular law. This was not merely accepted practice. This was written into religious law, recorded in temple protocols, considered as mandatory as any other religious ritual. To interfere would be blasphemy. To resist would be defying divine will. To speak against it would be attacking the foundations of social order. Economic incentives ensured enforcement at all levels. Temples received payments for providing preparation services, supplementing their income from other sources. Priestesses received stipends and status. Physicians gained prestige from attending royal families. Servants who maintained secrecy received rewards and protection. Everyone involved had material reasons to continue the system regardless of moral qualms. This comprehensive infrastructure explains why the system persisted despite causing obvious harm. It was not dependent on particularly cruel individuals. It was embedded in social structure, religious authority, economic incentives, legal framework, architectural design, and transmitted knowledge, making it resilient to challenge from any individual or small group. The psychological sophistication of the preparation system reveals understanding of human behavior that modern psychology only formalized in the 20th century. Isolation removed all support systems. A princess was separated from family, from childhood friends, from familiar servants, from anyone who had known her before betrothal. This meant she had no one to turn to for emotional support, no one to validate her perceptions of reality, no one to help her resist, no one to rescue her. Modern research on isolation confirms it is one of the most effective methods for breaking resistance because humans are social creatures who define themselves partly through relationships. Remove those relationships, and the self begins to fragment. Surveillance prevented recovery or resistance planning. Constant monitoring meant she could never relax, never speak freely, never even think clearly about resistance, because thinking requires some degree of mental privacy. When you know you are always being watched, you internalize that observation until you are watching yourself as strictly as any external observer. This creates permanent hypervigilance that persists long after the immediate threat ends. Unpredictability created learned helplessness through inconsistent rules and random punishments. When nothing you do reliably produces positive outcomes, when the same action is rewarded one day and punished the next, you stop trying to predict or control outcomes. You become passive and accept whatever happens, because attempting to avoid bad outcomes only leads to more confusion and pain. Physical violation taught that the body was not her own. Once you have been restrained and modified against your will, you understand viscerally that your body is not truly yours, that it belongs to whoever has power to hold you down. This creates profound helplessness that extends far beyond the immediate violation into every aspect of life. Language control restricted thought itself, forbidden from speaking, required to recite specific phrases thousands of times, certain concepts made dangerous to even think. This shaped thought patterns because language and thought are intimately connected. Control language, and you control the framework within which thinking occurs. Peer pressure turned potential allies into enforcers. Other princesses, who should have been allies sharing similar suffering, were pressured to report on each other, to congratulate each other on preparations, to publicly support the system. This meant you could not trust even people who shared your situation, creating paranoia and preventing collective resistance. Religious authority provided ultimate justification that could not be questioned. These were not human choices that might be wrong. These were divine requirements that by definition could not be questioned. To resist preparation was to resist the gods themselves, risking not just punishment in this life, but damnation in the afterlife. Duration was carefully calculated, lasting long enough to rewire neural pathways. Modern neuroscience confirms that sustained trauma changes brain structure physically. The princess who emerged from preparation was literally not the same person as the girl who entered, her brain having been physically altered by prolonged stress and trauma. These techniques should be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern understanding of coercive control. CIA interrogation manuals developed in the 20th century used remarkably similar methods. Cult programming follows identical patterns. Domestic abuse dynamics mirror this system. Modern trafficking operations use these methods deliberately. The knowledge of how to break human will has existed for thousands of years, has been refined through practice, has been transmitted across cultures and time periods, and remains in use today wherever vulnerable people are targeted for control. The immediate legacy spread rapidly through the ancient world, as empires observed Egyptian practices and adapted them for their own purposes. Greek royal families under both Macedonian and Ptolemaic dynasties adopted modified versions, combining Egyptian religious justification with Greek philosophical frameworks about the natural inferiority of women and the necessity of male control. Roman imperial families documented similar preparation practices for brides married to emperors, with sources describing pre-wedding rituals that Roman writers found disturbing even by their standards for accepted cruelty. Persian courts developed parallel systems that show either independent development or cultural transmission of similar ideas about controlling women through systematic preparation. By the classical period, every major empire around the Mediterranean and Middle East had some version of royal bride preparation. The specific rituals varied based on cultural and religious contexts. The underlying psychology remained remarkably constant. Young women from powerful families had to be rendered psychologically incapable of using their positions for independent political action. Medieval European royal marriages continued the pattern under Christian religious framework. Young princesses were prepared through isolation in convents, through ritual instruction that resembled cult indoctrination, through psychological pressure framed as religious duty, through physical examinations justified as ensuring virginity or verifying fitness for marriage. The methods evolved, but the function remained identical. Long-term impact extended far beyond royal families into institutional control of women more broadly. The techniques perfected on princesses were applied, with modifications, to women of all classes. What happens to a society when the women with the most privilege and protection can be systematically broken? It establishes that all women are subject to control, that female autonomy is not merely limited but legitimately eliminated, that women's bodies and minds are properly understood as property to be shaped for others' purposes. Modern coercive control follows the same patterns in disturbing detail. Legal systems in many jurisdictions still grant husbands authority over wives in ways that mirror ancient preparation systems. Social expectations that women should be compliant, quiet, deferential, that female anger or assertiveness is inappropriate. These are direct descendants of systematic preparation designed to eliminate independence. Domestic violence dynamics that isolate victims, that use unpredictable punishment, that create dependency, that attack sense of self. These replicate the preparation system's methods. Trauma bonding, as modern psychology understands, it has roots in these ancient practices. When the person who causes pain is also the only source of comfort, when family members are simultaneously perpetrators and the only available support, victims develop psychological adaptations that make leaving impossible. Egyptian princesses experienced this. Modern survivors experience this. The mechanism is identical across millennia. Even genetic evidence confirms lasting impact. DNA analysis of royal mummies shows markers of chronic stress, including shortened telomeres that indicate accelerated biological aging, immune system dysregulation consistent with long-term trauma exposure, and epigenetic changes that might have been transmitted to subsequent generations. The preparation did not just damage individuals, it damaged bloodlines in ways that persisted across generations. Cultural memory retained fear even after specific practices ended. When Pharaonic period concluded and Christianity spread through Egypt, different religious framework but control of women continued with recognizable patterns. Islamic Egypt centuries later developed practices that were different in religious justification, but recognizable in function. Modern Egypt, thousands of years removed from Pharaonic rule, shows patterns that researchers suggest might represent generational trauma from these ancient practices, though this remains speculative. The preparation system's most enduring legacy may be the template it provided for systematic control. Every subsequent empire studied what worked for Egypt. Every system of oppression adapted these techniques. The specific cultural justifications changed. The underlying methods remained remarkably constant. Understanding why this history was hidden reveals how power conceals its methods. Erasure itself is part of the control system, because if people do not know the techniques exist, they cannot recognize or resist them when applied. Ancient Egyptians themselves ensured erasure through deliberate choices about what to document publicly. Temple walls covered with hieroglyphics show happy royal weddings, smiling princesses, divine unions blessed by gods, ceremonies presented as joyful and sacred. Preparation chambers were underground, literally buried beneath structures that visitors could see. Medical texts describing injuries were kept in temple archives, accessible only to physicians and priests. Ostraka fragments with servants' accounts were literally garbage. Informal writings on pottery shards that were thrown away after use, only surviving accidentally when they were buried in construction fill or garbage dumps. Official art and monuments showed what the empire wanted people to believe. Beautiful princesses willingly marrying powerful men, serving purposes greater than themselves, fulfilling divine destiny with grace and happiness. Reality was buried, hidden, never acknowledged in any public document. When princesses died young, public monuments listed noble causes, serving the gods, complications of childbirth as divine women's duty, natural illness that befalls even the privileged. Never trauma from preparation, never psychological collapse, never system-caused death. Modern archaeology initially missed evidence because of what archaeologists were looking for and what they chose to see. 19th and early 20th century Egyptologists were treasure hunters and romance seekers, looking for gold and grand monuments, wanting to confirm biblical narratives or to find beautiful objects from museum collections. They were not asking questions about systematic violence against women. When they found preparation chambers, they labeled them generically as religious ritual spaces without deep investigation into specific purposes. When medical papyri were translated, Victorian-era sensibilities ensured euphemistic rendering. Explicit descriptions of procedures were translated vaguely. Violence became examination. Torture became instruction. Psychological destruction became religious preparation. Translators either could not comprehend what the texts were actually describing, or chose not to render it accurately in English because doing so would violate Victorian norms about discussing women's bodies or acknowledging that respected ancient civilizations engaged in systematic cruelty. Academic institutions, continuing into recent times, maintained erasure because uncomfortable truths complicated preferred narratives. Egypt was and remains beloved as ancient civilization, admired for pyramids and art and architectural achievements and mathematical innovation. Universities built entire departments around Egyptology. Museums filled wings with Egyptian collections. Tourism to Egypt became major industry, supporting modern Egyptian economy. Romantic narratives about ancient Egypt sold books, attracted students, generated research funding, supported museum attendance. Acknowledging systematic torture of royal women complicated these comfortable narratives. It raised difficult questions about the civilization being celebrated. It challenged assumptions about human progress and about which societies deserved admiration. It was easier to focus on pyramids than on what happened in chambers beneath them. Easier to admire gold artifacts than to ask about the girls buried wearing them. Easier to romanticize Cleopatra than to acknowledge what her ancestors did to their own daughters. Recent discoveries forced reconsideration as feminist archaeologists and trauma-informed researchers began asking different questions. What was this chamber really for? Why are medical texts describing these specific procedures? What do ostraca fragments actually say when translated without euphemism? Medical papyri reanalyzed through modern understanding of trauma revealed patterns previous translators missed or ignored. Preparation chamber archaeology with modern forensic techniques revealed true purposes of spaces labeled ambiguously for decades. Ostraca fragments received new attention as direct testimony rather than mundane records. Picture emerged of systematic, intentional, prolonged harm spanning 3,000 years. This was not culture or tradition, but engineered control maintained through every regime change because it was devastatingly effective. Let's return now to the Red Chamber beneath Karnak, where our story began. Princess Nefertari Merit on the limestone altar. 3 days have passed. The ceremony that was supposed to prepare her for sacred union is complete. She can barely move. The physical damage from obsidian blades and copper instruments and natron baths will never fully heal. Scarring will be permanent. Sensitivity changes will last the rest of her life. She cannot speak. Her voice is destroyed from screaming and from forced silence and from screaming again. Her will is broken so completely that the concept of resistance no longer exists in her mind. Her sense of self is erased beyond recovery. The girl who entered this chamber no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The priestesses congratulate each other around her motionless body. Another successful preparation. Another willful princess transformed into proper vessel. They record the ceremony's success in temple archives that will not be discovered for thousands of years. They clean the instruments and place them back in storage for the next time, because there will always be a next time, another princess, another preparation, the system perpetuating itself without end. She is carried to the bridal chamber because she cannot walk unassisted. Her body has been modified for marital purposes but is too damaged to move independently. The wedding night occurs. She survives it because she is no longer present. Dissociation is so complete that she experiences it from outside herself, watching her own body being used for purposes she no longer comprehends, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, being nothing except an object that responds mechanically to what is done to it. She produces one child in her years of marriage. Her body, damaged by preparations, can barely sustain pregnancy. She dies at age 22, buried with standard royal honors in a tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Hieroglyphics praise her as beloved wife and devoted mother and servant of the divine. Medical examination of her mummy in 2003 revealed the truth her culture tried to hide: severe pelvic trauma, chronic infection that had spread throughout her body, malnutrition from long-term inability to eat, bone density indicating premature aging. She died of failure to thrive, the clinical term for when a body simply gives up fighting to remain alive. The system killed her slowly, legally, acceptably within her culture, with full religious sanction. Her death changed nothing about the preparation system. The next princess was already in those underground chambers, already lying on that limestone altar, already experiencing the opening ceremony. The system continued unchanged because individual suffering was never reason enough to stop practices that served power. What does this history reveal that matters beyond academic interest in ancient practices? About power, it reveals that empires do not control only through obvious violence. The most effective control makes victims believe their suffering is necessary. Dress systematic torture in religious language, call it divine will, frame it as sacred duty, and victims will often submit to worse treatment than they would accept if it were acknowledged as cruelty. Make harm seem holy, and resistance becomes blasphemy. About trauma, it reveals that the body keeps the score, as modern researchers phrase it. Trauma does not end when the traumatic event ends. It persists in nervous systems, in altered brain structures, in chronic physical symptoms with no organic cause, in psychological patterns that survivors cannot simply choose to change. Trauma passes through generations, affecting children who were not present for the original harm, through mechanisms science is only beginning to understand. Systems that cause harm become self-perpetuating because victims often become administrators, unable to acknowledge their own trauma without confronting the system that caused it. So instead, they perpetuate it while convincing themselves it was necessary and beneficial. About erasure, it reveals that empires systematically hide what makes them look bad. Archaeological records are deliberately obscured. Official histories are rewritten to serve power. Public monuments show only approved narratives. Real history survives only in fragments, in garbage, in informal writings never meant for posterity, in evidence that was buried and forgotten and accidentally preserved. What we know about historical atrocities is a tiny fraction of what actually occurred, limited to what survived erasure. Why this matters today is not merely historical interest. These techniques are still used. Against women forced into marriages they do not choose in cultures that maintain bride price and marriage payments. Against members of high-control religious groups that use isolation and information control and peer pressure and religious authority to maintain absolute obedience. Against victims of trafficking who are broken through methods that precisely mirror ancient preparation systems. Against anyone targeted for systematic control in situations where power disparity allows sustained abuse. Recognizing the patterns is the first step to stopping them. When you understand how isolation, surveillance, unpredictability, physical violation, language control, peer pressure, religious authority, and duration combine to break a person systematically. You can identify when these patterns are being used in modern contexts. You can intervene when possible. You can refuse to be complicit. You can name what is happening. You can support survivors who need someone to validate that what happened to them was real and wrong and not their fault. History that is hidden continues to repeat. History that is acknowledged can be prevented from repeating. These stories matter because the techniques have never disappeared, only evolved. For all the princesses who suffered and died in those preparation chambers beneath temples and palaces across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. For Nefertari Merit, age 14, who died at 22 with medical evidence of severe trauma that her culture inflicted deliberately. For Sitamun, age 13, who disappeared at 17 after being psychologically erased to enable marriage to her own father. For Berenike III, age 20, who was murdered after resisting despite intensive preparation, whose death sparked riots but changed nothing about the system. For Meritaten, whose resistance was broken so completely through social erasure that her very self ceased to exist, whose fate remains unknown because even historical records erased her as thoroughly as the system erased her personality. For Arsinoe II, who survived physically to age 48 but died psychologically decades earlier, who held power but was described by everyone who knew her as already dead. For the 200-plus others whose names survive in historical records, each name representing a person who experienced suffering we can only partially imagine from fragmentary evidence. For the countless others whose names were deliberately erased from history, who were no less real and whose suffering was no less devastating for having been forgotten. For the servants who witnessed preparations and carried that trauma silently because speaking meant death. For the priestesses who were forced to perpetrate because they had been victims and knew no alternative. For the physicians who documented harm without preventing it because the system was bigger than individual conscience. They survived impossible things. Some resisted with every fiber of their being. All deserved better than what their empire did to them. Their suffering was not divine will but calculated control. Their breaking was not necessary but politically expedient. Their erasure from history was intentional because power always hides its methods. Our remembering them is necessary because they were real people who experienced real suffering, because the techniques used on them are still in use, because silence enables continuation of harm, because speaking truth about historical atrocities is how we prevent modern ones. This is the history they tried to bury beneath 3,000 years of sand. This is what happens when empires decide that breaking human beings serves their interests. This is why we need to keep telling these stories. Subscribe to this channel if you want more hidden histories exposed. Comment below telling me which other royal atrocities you want uncovered. Which women's suffering has been deliberately erased from the official records? Where in the world are you listening from? These stories matter because they reveal patterns of control that persist today. These voices deserve to be heard because silence enables continuation of harm. And we are just getting started, uncovering what empires tried to hide forever.